Okay, so hello everyone. Today we're going to be looking at a text that is preserved in a, let's say, high medieval manuscript preserved on Mt Athos, particularly the monastery of Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, who, if you don't know, was the Greek pagan philosopher present at the Areopagus when Paul gave his famous oration about the unknown God um, to the pagan Athenians in order to convert them to Christianity. He's one of the few, along with a woman called Damaris, who espoused the faith after hearing that oration. And of course, there's a corpus of literature ascribed to him, um, very Platonic theology and mystagogy, as well as some epistles that are very interesting, particularly if they're treated as having historicity. But at any rate, what is this manuscript and what is it about? Well, it tells the, shall we say, backstory of Judas Iscariot, how he came to become a disciple of Jesus Christ, and also uh, contains details about his childhood and infancy and various elements of prophecy pertaining to what would befall him. And as we'll see towards the end of this talk, after we've examined the primary text itself, we'll see that there are a lot of typological resemblances to various ancient Greek pre-Christian stories, prophecies, and cosmological concepts. So it's just interesting to note that there is this kind of broad typology to the Judas Iscariot backstory that can actually be mapped onto a more universal history, if you will. So without further ado, I just want to open with this particular painting. It shows the infant Moses, as you can see there in a wicker basket, being attended to by the servants of the Pharaoh's daughter, who adopts this circumcised infant and rears this Hebrew child as one of her own, as you all know from the Exodus story. And the reason I put that there at the start of this examination of a manuscript telling an extra biblical story about Judas Iscariot's life is because, as we're going to see, this typological motif, for lack of a better word, of an infant being set adrift on a body of water and then being recovered and rising to greatness or infamy in the case of Judas Iscariot, is a common theme that links the Moses narrative and the one we're going to now encounter about Judas Iscariot, which is interesting from a typological point of view. He's almost, we can think of him as like a kind of anti-Moses, who instead of, like saving his people during Pesach, during the Passover of Pascha, right, instead he actually does the inverse of, at least from the Christian perspective, bringing about the destruction of his people, which of course is identified with the plundering of the temple by the Romans in 70 AD. It's also worth briefly noting too that there are even figures from antiquity like Sargon of Akkad, who was said in mythic texts that have been preserved in cuneiform to have been found as an infant set adrift on the waters. So it's actually it's a common motif, and we're going to see some ancient Greek stories towards the end of the talk too, where this motif occurs. So it goes well beyond the merely biblical and is part of a more universal typology, if you will. So without further ado, let us turn to this edition of the St. Dionysius Monastery, Mt Athos manuscript, telling the backstory, if you will, of Judas Iscariot. As you can see, the title is With Respect to or Regarding the Lawless Judas. Now, I'm going to just do a live translation of the original text that is displayed here for those who can read Greek. So, a certain one from among the wise men said, that the lawless Judas was from the country of Iscariot and was from the tribe of the Jews, i.e., the tribe of Judah, right? And the name of his father was Robel. And this Robel had a wife, and one night she dreamed a dream that was most frightening, and she became frightened out of her wits and shocked. And with a great fear, she began to cry out in a loud voice. And her husband came to her saying, "What happened to you, oh my wife? Why are you so distressed?" And she says back to him, "I dreamed a dream, a frightful dream, that I shall conceive and give birth to a male child, and this child shall be the dissolution of the Jews, i.e., the destruction of the Jewish people." And her husband rebuked her on account of her putting her trust in dreams. Nonetheless, the woman did conceive on that very night. And at the fulfillment of the time of her pregnancy, she gave birth to a male child. And this woman intended to destroy the child, i.e., to kill the child, so that the race or the people, the ethnos of the Jews might not be destroyed. And so she secretly, unbeknownst to her husband, created a Theban or Thevian, that is a like wicker basket. The same kind of word is used for baby Moses in the Greek version of the book of Exodus, right? The Septuagint recension. So she makes a basket for him, or an ark, we could say, to create that parallelism with Noah, because there is an element of that. Because Noah's vessel, of course, is a wooden box, in essence, that's sealed with pitch, afloat on the waters of destruction, right? There's a similar typological connection here. So she made this wicker basket for the child in secret that she intended to destroy so that the Jewish people wouldn't be destroyed. And she cast the basket with the child in it, implied, into the sea. For there was across from Iscariot a small island, the text says. And on this island, there dwelt inhabitants who were people who reared animals, i.e., shepherds and cowherds, presumably shepherds. It just says those who rear beasts, so shepherds. And the wicker basket, the vessel, was brought to this place by the waves, and the people of the island, taking it up, found inside a male child. And the child was suckled, was given breast, but rather than human milk, it was given milk from the animals of the island. And they named the child Judas, for they considered the child to be from among the Judeans, i.e., from the tribe of Judah, right? And so when the child was weaned, i.e., when it stopped consuming milk and had, grown up a bit, they brought the child to Iscariot through the narrow channel that was between this place, i.e., their island, and the sea across from Iscariot, right? And they asked, "Who shall rear this child?" And Robel, the child's father, came and took the child, not knowing who it was. Right? So in ignorance, he adopted the child. For the child was very beautiful, very seasonally comely in his appearance. right? Horaios, oreos. And the child's mother loved this child, remembering the baby which she cast into the sea. So rather oddly, despite having cast the child into the sea herself, and the fact that this unknown child is brought by these shepherds from the island across the strait from Iscariot, she doesn't suspect that it could actually be the child she disposed of, presumably because she presumes that the child died and that this is some other child. Okay, back to the text. And she conceived and birthed yet another son and reared the two together in one spirit as siblings, the second child and the basket baby. Right? But Judas was sly or wicked, evil, and he would hit his own brother. And it was such that it was quite an often occurrence. And the mother would teach him, saying, "Stop doing this, oh my child. Do not strike him, for he happens to be your brother." And inasmuch as all the things that you and that I and your father own, they are for the both of you, right? So you will inherit equally. There's no favoritism. Just relax. He's your brother, right? Everything that I and your father own is to be distributed to both of you equally, right? But nonetheless, this wicked shoot, i.e. vegetational shoot, right? This wicked root, so to speak, on account of the love of money, smelted out, so to speak, a jealousy and plotted to kill him, i.e. his brother, his own brother. And in one of these days, so one day, the two of them were going together to a certain place, and Judas rose up and he killed his brother with a stone upon the temple, and the brother died. And then Judas left the region and moved to Jerusalem. And since he loved money so much, literally silver, but money, he became an acquaintance of Herod, the king of the Judeans. And the king saw that he was a man who was both capable and comely in appearance. And so he made him a kind of business manager in charge of buying and selling, and to kind of manage business in the marketplace. And after a great deal of time, there arose a kind of rebellion of scandals in the marketplace in Iscariot. And so Robel took his wife and all of his possessions and came to Jerusalem. Okay, so now the biological parents of Judas, who lost their second biological child to their first biological child, unbeknownst to them about the identity of the first biological child, have now moved to the city, where the escapee murderer Judas, their first child, is working as a kind of business agent for King Herod. Okay. So the parents came with all their possessions, bereft of their second child, to Jerusalem. And because he was rich, he bought lovely homes close to the gardens, the paradises, because paradise literally means something that's encircled all around by a wall. So these walled gardens, these paradises of Herod. So being rich, Robel came and bought housing close to the gardens, the walled gardens of Herod, which had trees inside. Now, after much time, Judas did not know and recognize his father or his mother, his biological father and mother, / adoptive ones, right? And so too, they did not know or recognize him with the passage of time, because he's grown up much. Presumably, when he killed his sibling, he was very young, and now he's obviously much older. Okay, so back to the text. So one of these days, the king happened to be looking out over through his window over to the garden of Robel next door, rather than his own gardens, right? And Judas was with him and said to the king, "O king, do you wish that I should take from the blossomings of those trees, so that I should go down and take some of them, i.e., rob the fruit from the garden of Robel?" And going out through the window, he took as many of the fruits as he wanted. But as he sought to leave and escape the premises, he actually encountered his father, Robel, his biological father, unbeknownst to him, Robel. And he said to him, i.e., Robel, the father, said to the son, whom he doesn't recognize, "On account of what, O young man? How have you dared to come into my walled garden when I was not there, or when I was not here, in order to take fruit thereof?" But he was bold and he was raw, i.e., crude, and he stood against Robel, and looking this way and that way and seeing that no one was there, he killed his own father, unbeknownst to him that he was his father, but he killed the man, he killed his father with a stone in the same manner that he did his brother, not knowing all the while. And he took the fruits to the king, and he told him about the death of Robel. Now, hearing these things, the king was sad, but nonetheless was quiet until they buried Robel. And after these things, the king said to Judas, "I wish, I desire, I plan that you should take that widow as your wife, so that you can become an inheritor of his inheritance." And then the king sent off Judas. So that means to say that King Herod saw the gardens next door, desired them, got his fruit. Judas killed his father, and now King Herod thinks, well, if I get my buddy, my business manager, to marry the deceased man's wife, then he will become owner of that property with these desirable gardens, and we can share that land together, right? Incidentally, as a side note, that icon on the bottom there where you see like an empty halo, and then you see Judas Iscariot exiting the door with a small devil on his shoulder, that's just an iconographic depiction of him departing from the Last Supper, the mystical supper, right, the divine communion of the apostles, and in so doing, like renouncing his holy halo, and instead being led by a demon to pursue money and betray his master, his Rabbi Christ. And these mosaics from Byzantine/Norman Sicily, from buildings like the Cappella Palatina in Palermo and Monreale Cathedral just outside of there as well. They depict the story of Cain and Abel, obviously, the fratricide, the killing of the brother, which I think is an important kind of subtext or comparandum to this story of Judas Iscariot killing his brother. Now, another thing I should also note is that before, when I was talking about the Robel bringing all of his property to Jerusalem, being rich and buying pleasant housing close to Herod's housing. It's unclear whether Herod himself had gardens. It seems that the gardens that are being spoken about here that have trees inside are Robel's and not Herod's. But it's also possible that Herod had an enclosed garden as well. The grammar is slightly ambiguous. It doesn't really matter or affect the story because the point was that Herod desired the fruit of Robel's garden, and that Robel indeed did have paradises, that is, walled gardens. Of course, the whole connection between these walled gardens and paradise and the fruit temptation is another interesting typological analogy, right? The fruit of temptation, right? With Herod and Judas falling into sin through the temptation of a walled garden and its forbidden fruit, right? That's pretty interesting parallelism. So there's a lot of rich typology in this narrative. So where were we? So back to the text, back to the story. So Herod conceives of this plot. I want you to marry the widow of the slain man so that you can become an inheritor of the property. And Herod, sent Judas with a kind of pretense, saying to the woman, my kingdom wishes, i.e. the king who rules over me, wishes for me to mate, to wed another man. So all for your riches to be adjoined to the kingdom. And so the woman, hearing these words, agreed or was persuaded to take a husband so that her wealth would not be destroyed. So it seems that the plot here that is related or relayed to the woman is that it's either in accordance with royal demand you marry some man, or your property, which is assumedly the subtext is, which presumably can't be run by a woman on her own, will be like usurped by the neighboring royal property. So you either maintain independence, inverted commas, by marrying, and not being just a sole spinster widow on her own, incapable of managing the property, or you either marry and thus maintain ownership with your new husband, or you have to give it up for it to become like royal ground, to be annexed by Herod's palace next door. That's kind of the message there. And she didn't want to lose it, so she agrees to marry. Again, it's this love of money theme. And so she took her own son to be her husband, who was Judas, not knowing that it was so, and she bore sons with him, and they went forth and lived together in one spirit, so to speak, for a significant amount of time as a family. And then one day she came to herself, so to speak, and that she was like introspectively reflecting, the woman that is, and she was thinking and remembering as many things as she underwent, as she suffered with her children in the past, and with respect to her husband as well, and his bitter death. And she was crying and wailing in a most woeful manner. That she and she was lamenting the fact that she took another husband, even though she didn't actually desire or really want another one. And lo, her husband, who, as we said, was Judas, asked her, saying, "What is this lamentation and this wailing of yours? What is it about?" And since she was forced, the woman started to, with great detail, narrate and elaborate all the evils that had befallen her. That she cast her child into the sea, and that there were shepherds of the tribe of Judah who brought him out of the sea. And again, she told of the death of his brother and of Robel. Okay, and so when he heard all of these things, Judas said to her, I am your son, whom you cast into the sea, and I killed my brother and my father Robel. I did all of these things. And when the woman heard this, that this man was her son, she wished to die a bitter death. And she cried out, saying, Woe is me, most wretched woman. Where should I hide? How should I flee from this threat and this anger from God? For it is no longer proper for us even to exist. She built whales, right? And so hearing these evils, Judas, well, hearing all these evils that his desire for silver, for money, had brought about, and knowing that there was a certain Christ who was a doctor of the soul and of the body in Jerusalem, Judas and that teacher, Christ, was calling sinners to repentance. Judas went forth to confess. And since Christ was so merciful, was distinguished by his bowels of mercy, so to speak, he made him, i.e. Judas, a disciple. So after finding out the situation, he leaves his mother wife, runs to this famous Christ healer to become a disciple and to try and rectify his life. And since he, i.e. Christ, knew or understood the passion of love of money, love of silver that was in Judas Iscariot, since he knew that, he deliberately gave him the glossokomon, that is the like treasury box, right? The purse of the group of disciples, the treasury box. And he made him keep all of the funds that were placed therein for the purpose of almsgiving, right? Mercy gifts to the poor, right? As well as all the denarii, the currency that was for the consumption of the food of the apostles. And yet nonetheless, he was stealing them and was stealing the funds to his wife and children, i.e. his mother. Okay. Now, what an interesting backstory all of that is, right? The fact that he ends up engaging, unbeknownst to himself, initially in coitus with his own mother and making her his wife in pursuit of funds. The fact that he, like Cain, kills his own brother. The fact that, like Moses, he's set adrift on the waters in a box. The fact that there's an attempt to destroy him so that the whole people might be spared, which is language that occurs in the gospel accounts of Christ, the attempt by the Sanhedrin to destroy Christ so that the people can be spared. And of course, there's a whole typological similarity there with the notion of the scapegoat who's sent out and all the sins of the people are cast into that animal ritually so that the people can be spared from destruction. Interesting how all these themes come together. Now, so much for the manuscript from Mt Athos. That's the main gist of the backstory, but there's a little bit more that I want to take from a separate source, namely preserved in the writings of Apollinaris of Laodicea, who's a questionable figure in church history, whose writings have mainly been preserved in extracts in other authors. But in this case, he is in turn preserving material from an early apostolic father, namely Papias of Hierapolis in Phrygia. And the information ascribed to this Papias figure through Apollinaris, who's preserved in various authors, is this passage here that pertains to how Judas Iscariot's life ended, his death. Now, obviously those who know the Gospel of Matthew know about him casting the coins away back at the Sanhedrin, then going and killing himself, committing, self-destruction through the means of hanging. Obviously, that's a rough topic. Hopefully, I don't get demonetized. Not like I make any money anyway for saying that. But there is the fact that in the book of Acts, that's also in the canonical Christian Bible, there's a separate account of him like owning a field and falling down, his guts exploding on the field. And that seems like a contradiction, right? How do you have a figure who throws the money away at the Sanhedrin who bribed him initially, right? And then goes and does that deed. How do you reconcile that with him using the funds to buy like a portion of land, working it for an extended period of time, and then his guts blowing up on that field? They seem like contradictions unless there's some way of synthesizing them. So the text here with information stemming from Papias of Hierapolis says this, that Judas did not actually die by means of the noose hanging, but rather he survived the incident, the attempted hanging, and he was taken down before he actually asphyxiated. And this is conveyed by the so-called Acts of the Apostles, right, the book of the New Testament, where it says that he fell down on his face, and his midriff kind of exploded, and his guts spilled out. And this is most clearly explained by Papias, who was a disciple of John. And he said these things in the book, one of the books of his text called the Exegesis or Explanation of the Words of the Lord. It's the fourth book of that text, i.e. the fourth tome of that series. That's what the delta there stands for. It's a numeral. And furthermore, we have this information from text ascribed ultimately to Papias as well, that Judas was a great example of irreverence or unholiness in this world. And he walked about swollen a great deal in his flesh, such that he could not even get into a cart, like the vehicle, and nor could he easily, nor was he able to easily pass through tight areas implied, because he was so swollen. Due to the great bulk of his head. So he seemed to have some kind of hydrocephalus situation. And his eyelashes were so, and eyelids rather, I should say, his eyelids were so swollen that he could barely even see the light. And even doctors kind of intervening and trying to, use tools to kind of open up his eyes and his vision were not successful. So great was the weight which was pressing down on the surface from outside, so to speak, the surface of his eyes. His eyelids were so fattened that, they closed in his eyes from the weight. And his genitalia were such that they were like a very vile and a great source of ugliness and shame, and appeared to be like very large, so like priapically swollen almost. And from his body there was always like exuding a like an ichor that is like a gooey substance, as well as worms were spilling out of his flesh. Um, uh, on like, and all this was on account of like hubris. Hubris in Greek like has particular connotations, not necessarily like how it's used always in modern English parlance. Here it more means like being punished and being made to be ashamed on account of the evils done by the individual. Um, and after many such tortures and punishments, he died in his own village, or in his own plot of land at any rate. And that plot of land became barren on account of the terrible smell, and was consequently that plot of land was not inhabited up until now, Papias says, right? And as a disciple of John, he's living very close to the time, right? So it's not inhabited because it stinks so much. It's barren. Even up until today, says Papias. People, even up until today, people are not even capable of, passing through that area if they do not put their hands over their nose and block their nostrils. For so much was the excretion from his flesh onto that earth. So far did it advance. So that's a very grim description from extra biblical sources, but nonetheless very early, culturally authoritative apostolic documents about how Judas Iscariot died. So now we have the complete picture of his life, right? His beginning, his middle, and his end. So it's just worth, I've already kind of hinted at this anyway. Here you see on the left an icon of the kiss betraying Christ before the band of troops, I suppose, sent by the Sanhedrin to arrest Christ. And you see there Peter cutting off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the high priest. You'll see depictions on the right of they're supposed to be depictions of the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's just important to keep in mind as the kind of subtext. There is this idea, if we recall, that early in the text from Mt Athos telling the life of Judas Iscariot, it says that there was a prophecy that the prophetic dream that the mother has is that her people will be destroyed by this child living out his life. And of course, the implication here in Christian cosmology, right, is that the 70 AD fall of Jerusalem occurred because of the wickedness of this child, the curse he brings to his people in rejecting, God incarnate is the message of the text. Now, it's worth reflecting on the fact that there is an obvious typological similarity in this story to what we see in the famous tale of Oedipus, as told in Sophocles' plays, as well as elsewhere, like in the Bibliotheca of Apollodorus, or Pseudo-Apollodorus, if you insist. So you probably know this tale, but just in brief, the general gist of it is that Oedipus's parents, when he was a baby, perceived through prophecy that this child would kill his father. And so for that reason, they disposed of the child. They pricked his feet and cast him out as a baby. Now, interestingly, his name, Oedipus, right, actually means we have the word edema that comes from that word, that same root, and pus is foot. So edema foot, swollen foot. It's interesting that there's another typological similarity there with Judas Iscariot in these extra biblical narratives, right? In this case of Papias, the fact that he had the swelling problem, Oedipus had this swollen foot problem as well. So another link aside from the killing the father and sleeping with the mother. At any rate, so the child's cast out, reared by a shepherd, doesn't die as was presumably intended by the parents. Later on, his father, Laius, is goes to liberate his city Thebes from the oppression of the Sphinx by solving her riddle. But on the way, Oedipus, now grown up, that is Laius's own son, encounters him, and they have a skirmish, and the son kills the father. He then, Oedipus himself, then goes, confronts the Sphinx, solves the riddle, which, as you probably know, is a famous one. It's like, what kind of creature goes initially on 4 legs, then on 2, and then on 3? And the answer is, of course, man, because he initially crawls as an infant, then he walks around as a grown man, and then he gets old and needs a walking stick, right? So then he slays the Sphinx, and as a result of liberating Thebes from that oppression, he becomes king, right? Remember, his dad that he just killed was the king formerly. So in becoming king, he becomes spouse to the current queen, Jocasta, or Jocasta, I suppose it's Jocasta, his mother. So he copulates with his own mother. And then later when he finds out about what he's done, that he's killed his own father and that he's copulated with his mother, he gouges out his own eyes. And interestingly, 2 of his children, Eteocles and Polynices, later in the epic story of the 7 against Thebes, told in Aeschylus's tragic writings, the 2 brothers kill each other at the same time in their war over kingship. And that's part of the same curse that sort of brought about all that befell Oedipus. So again, we have this fratricidal element that we saw in the Judas Iscariot tale occurring here in the Oedipus cycle as well. But there's even more stuff from the Greco-Roman world that typologically parallels what we see in the Judas Iscariot mythic cycle, for lack of a better word. So here I've extracted a text from the Bibliotheca of Apollodorus, and he says this, and soon we'll see how this relates to Judas Iscariot, but it's actually about Troy. So when Ilion, or Ilium, i.e. that is the city of Troy, was taken by Heracles, after a little while, it is said that Podarches reigned as king. This Podarches being called Priamos, i.e. Priam. As a side note, the idea with that is the name change is because Priamos is said to come from a verb meaning to sell, because he was sold as a captive, and so he got that nickname, Mr. Hostage. That's the folkloric etymological tale behind the name change. But at any rate, so he, Priam, first marries Arisbe, the daughter of Merops, and from him has a son called Essacus, or Isacos, right? Essacus. And that Essacus married Asterope, who's the daughter of Kebren. And when he lamented her death, he became a bird. Okay. Now, Priam gave Arisbe to a certain man called Hesychus, and then he married a second wife, namely Hecabe or Hecuba, the daughter of Dumas, or as others say of Chryseis, or as others say of Singarius, the river, and his wife Metope. Different parentages. At any rate, it doesn't really affect the story. Here's where it starts to be relevant to our Judas Iscariot study. Okay. And so first was born Hector to Hecabe, to Hecuba. And then second, there was to be born a baby and yet another one, second child. And it seemed to Hecabe or Hecuba during her sleep that there was like a dalos, that is like a torch of fire, right? A stick on fire, that she was going to give birth actually to such a flaming torch. Right? So in other words, in a dream, it appears to her in a vision to Hecabe, Hecuba, the queen of Troy, the second wife of Priam. She sees in her dream this flaming torch, and she sees that it distributes flame to all of the city and consumes the whole city of Troy in fire, hence the painting, which you see there with the Trojan horse and the city in flames. So she dreams when she's about to be pregnant with this second child, namely Paris, right? Who, as we all know, steals Helen of Troy and thus brings about the Trojan War and the destruction of the city. So she has a prophetic dream that this kid is going to be like a firebrand, is going to be like a torch, is going to consume his native city in fire. Right? That's an exact parallel, really, in a way, to what we saw with the Judas Iscariot mother dreaming that this child is going to bring about the destruction of Jerusalem, and hence wanting to kill the child. Okay, so back to Apollodorus now. So when Priam learnt of this from Hecuba Hecabe about this dream, he sent for his son Essechus, who presumably is not a bird yet. So he brought him, for he was a neuromantic seer, right? Like he was an interpreter of dreams, which a trade, a kind of techne, an art which he learnt from the mother of his father, Merops. And he said, Essechus, the interpreter of dreams and prophets, said, and prophecies, said that the child would become the destruction of their country. And so he commanded for the child to be exposed, i.e., to be cast out to die. And so when the child was born, Priam gave the child to a servant to dispose of, and that servant took the child to Mount Ida. This servant was called Agelaus, and when the child was exposed, after 5 days, it was reared by a bear. Okay, so note as a parallel, incidentally, like Romulus and Remus being reared famously suckled by a wolf. And of course, Aeneas, a Trojan, is related in some ways to the foundation of Rome. So that's kind of an interesting parallel. There are lots of characters reared by animals, admittedly, in Greek myth. It's a common trope. But back to the text now. So the child Paris is reared by a she-bear, okay? And so when the child is like later found, he's saved and taken up, and he's brought to villages and reared there as his own child, and he's named Priam. Okay, and when he became a young man, he was distinguished from many others in his strength and beauty, and for that reason he was called Alexander, for he defended people against robbers or brigands or violent attackers, and he also protected flocks of sheep and goats, presumably, because he was a helper of people. And after a short while, he found his own parents. And then later on, Hecabe gave birth to several daughters, Creusa, Laodice, Polyxene, who incidentally gets like ritually sacrificed as a human sacrifice after the fall of Troy, and also Cassandra, aka Alexandra. Put a pin in that because that figure, that prophetess, daughter of Hecuba Hecabe, is highly significant, as we'll see later. Cassandra, also known as Alexandra. because the text here says, Apollodorus says of Cassandra / Alexandra, that she was not willing to copulate with Apollo, even when he promised to teach her the mantic art. So even though she learned the mantic art, though, she didn't sleep with him. And on account of that, he took away from her mantic power that he gave her, her prophetic power, the ability to be believed by people and to persuade them. So she remained capable of seeing the future and the truth and speaking it, but he made it such that no one would believe her. And he did that in retaliation to her not having coitus with him. Right? Okay, so that's interesting. We'll return to the Troy situation soon, but it's worth being aware of the fact that there is that motif of the dream of a flaming torch and a child being the destruction of his city, and this idea that the parents attempt to destroy the child and abandon him, and yet the child ends up coming back and assuming power. Okay. Now, there's further instances of children in the Greek world who have such ominous births. So this is taken from Plutarch's Life of Alexander the Great. So Alexander, with respect to his stock on his father's side, was a Heraclid, a descendant of Hercules from Caranos. And on his mother's side, he was an Aeacid, a descendant of Aeacus, through Neoptolemus, namely the son of Achilles. And all of this is, widely respected and considered trustworthy information and totally verified, says Plutarch. And it is said that Philip, i.e. the king of Macedonia, who will become ostensibly the father of Alexander the Great, Philip kind of got to know Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great, when they were initiated together in the mysteries of the cult of Samothrace. Incidentally, as a side note, that cult involved the Cabaroi, these divinities at that site who were worshipped there. There, we know from figures like Clement of Alexandria, those divinities who instituted that initiation ritual had, as part of their mythic cycle, an event of fratricide, a killing of a brother. So that's, again, an interesting kind of typological link there back to that Cain and Abel theme. But at any rate, and the whole Romulus and Remus theme as well. But back to the text here of Plutarch. So they got initiated together on Samothrace, and he was a young man, and he fell in love with this girl, Olympias, who was then like orphaned of her parents. And so they arranged a marriage, and he, Philip, persuaded her brother Erebus to give Olympias to him as a bride. But when she was a bride, before the night of the consummation of their marriage, so to speak, Philip went into the chamber, and it, as he went to go in, it appeared as if there was like a bolt of lightning that fell down on her belly, her stomach, accompanied by a great thunderous boom. And from the wound, so to speak, from the striking, there arose a fire. And this fire spread out into flames in all directions, and kind of dissipated. And after some time, after the wedding, Philip saw a dream where a seal, a wax seal, was placed on the belly of his wife, and the kind of mark of the seal, he observed it was the likeness or icon image of a lion. And so when Mantic priestly experts examined this vision, they told Philip that he needed like a great deal of attentive watch over his marriage, and a certain Aristandros, who was a Telmessian, he said that this woman would give birth for no one would ever put a seal on something that is empty. And he claimed in his interpretation, this Aristandros, that the child that she would give birth to would be lion-like in his nature and have a powerful thymos, that is a spirited part of his soul. He'd be like energetic and aggro, okay, and lion-like. So again, why do I bring this up in connection with Judas Iscariot? Well, there's the dream element of this child being unusual, this motif of fire and lightning, but the fire and lightning motif of the dream relates now to this next bit of detail that Plutarch relates. He says that, he goes on in the same area of the text, he says that Alexander was born in the month of Hekatombion, which the Macedonians call Lawn, namely on the sixth day, which was when the temple of Artemis was in Ephesus was burnt down. So it's highly significant, right? The temple of Artemis, you see the ruins of it on the top right, was one of the most amazing cult centers of the ancient world, right? It was one of the ancient wonders of the world. Little of it remains today. Interestingly, there's like an extra biblical tradition preserved, I believe, in the Acts of John, a text called the Acts of John, where John, the disciple of Christ, has a confrontation with the priesthood of Artemis in the temple, and he brings about its destruction through like a kind of earthquake by invoking God, which is interesting, I suppose. But anyway, returning to the situation here, in Plutarch's text, so Alexander the Great, whose birth was associated with lightning and fire, right, in that divine vision that was interpreted as signaling his birth as a mighty lion, okay, it's later said then by Plutarch that he's born on the same day as the destruction of the temple of Artemis. So that's considered an omen. So Hegesias, the Magnesian, then promulgated an announcement that could like snuff out a great fire on account of its coldness. So that is to say that this promulgation of Hegesias is like so cold, in inverted commas, that it could snuff out a huge fire. And what is this promulgation? Well, he says, it would appear, it would seem, imagistically, so to speak, that the temple of Artemis was burnt down because she was, i.e. Artemis, was preoccupied with the birthing of Alexander. Okay, so you can see why that's a cold statement, because it's a little bit like blasphemous, I suppose, in the sense that the goddess would like vacate her most important divine site and let it be destroyed because she was concerned with birthing Alexander the Great. Okay. But there were many magi who were in Ephesus at that time, i.e. Zoroastrian priests, and they considered what the temple suffered or underwent to be a sign of something else, and they beat their faces and cried out that this signified that there would be a great destruction in Asia brought about by the birthing that occurred on that day. So that is to say that according to Plutarch, there was a tradition that Zoroastrian magi who witnessed the temple burning in Artemis on the day that Alexander the Great was born, right, as a result of that vision, dream vision of the lightning, right, these magi believed that this was a sign that there would be a figure who was born that day, a human, who would bring about the fiery destruction of the east of Asia. And of course, we know from Diodorus Siculus that a certain Thais, a woman like a Hetaira, who was with Alexander the Great and his army and companions when they were having like a drunken Dionysian festival in the streets of Persepolis, they were like engaged in like a Dionysiac ritual procession in their celebration of their victory. This woman apparently incited them to burn down the city of Persepolis. So destruction by fire brought about by a child who was born on an ominous day during a fire in a temple, who was brought about by a dream that involved like lightning and fire. And I didn't extract it here, but Plutarch also mentions how King Philip apparently opened the door and pried in with his eye and saw his wife copulating with a divine serpent. And he was later like told through divine vision that he would lose the eye that looked at what he wasn't supposed to look at. And all of this is part of the mythology of Alexander the Great being a son of Zeus Ammon, right? And the oracle of Ammon in Egypt promulgating him as the son of God, queens depicting him with like horns, ram's horns to show his divinity, hence his role in the Quran as the horned one, right? Dhul al-Qarnayn or something like that. Pardon my useless Arabic. I don't know that language. But yeah, you get the gist that he's this kind of ominous, divine child who brought about fiery destruction through his fiery, ominous birth. Now, there's also like another very late, as far as its written recording is concerned, Midrashic tale. So it's ascribed to a certain Ashkenazi rabbi who lived in the like 1700s, called Rabbi Abraham Vilna, and he tells a story, a midrashic story about Joshua, son of Nun, Yehoshua ben Nun. The word Nun in like Hebrew refers to Aramaic refers to like a fish or at any rate a sea animal of some sort. Okay, so the story goes that he tells in this late text, but I mean, who can really say how old the story is? We can't know for sure, though many people are inclined to dismiss it as a late accretion and a folkloric story. But regardless, the tale goes like this, and I bring it up because it's an interesting comparandum for our Judas Iscariot study. So when Joshua was born as an infant, there was a prophecy that he was going to kill his father. So he was packed up in a box, wicker basket presumably, and placed on the waters, much like Moses, much like Judas Iscariot. Right? Now, the story says that a sea creature swallows the infant. Then the Pharaoh's fishermen, this is set in Egypt, the Pharaoh's fishermen catch this huge fish, and because it's such an amazing fish, they bring it to the Pharaoh, they cut it open to serve him a banquet, and out of the aquatic animal, the fish, emerges this babe. And so that's quite a miraculous entrance. And so the child is highly esteemed, is adopted, is reared in the court, and eventually becomes an executioner. And he ends up killing his own dad, who gets into trouble with the Pharaoh without knowing that it's actually his father. So again, strong typological resemblance to the Judas Iscariot tale in many ways. The sea creature dynamic is also interesting because if we cast our minds back to the passage from Polydorus about Troy and the prophecy of Paris being being born as in and shown in a dream to be like this torch that would consume his whole city, much as Judas Iscariot would destroy his city and his people by his ominous birth. In that context, it's worth noting that the daughters I mentioned of either of Prime or Laomedon, there's different sources about that, but it amounts to the same thing. There were these daughters of Troy who were offered, like Andromeda in a way, to a sea monster to be eaten as like a peace offering to ward it away from the walls of Troy. And Heracles later saved one such maiden, Hesione, and in one tradition, at any rate, I think preserved in a Hellenistic writer called Scytobrachion, but it's narrated in Diodorus Siculus and other places. Heracles saves the maiden from the sea monster and liberates the city of Troy and takes control of it. But so again, like there's like this sea creature dynamic as part of swallowing humans. That's also part of this typology, as we're going to see further. There's also, I think it's in the Talmud, I didn't include the passage here, I can't exactly remember, but I've seen like a rabbinic account somewhere of the fact that in the Torah, Joshua doesn't have like any descendants and it's a bit ambiguous. And there's a line there about him like chopping off a head in the sense of him like cutting off his lineage by not having children. But that chopping off of the head motif has clearly informed this midrash where he like executes his own dad unbeknownst to him. At any rate, there's also another passage in the Talmud, Megillah 14b, that I've extracted here. So it says that even though the Torah claims that Joshua, son of Nun, is the last in his genealogical line, it's nonetheless said by the Talmudic sages that he married Rahab, the prostitute. If you recall from the story in the Torah where there's a red silken thread that's dangling from a window so that the spies that go into the land of Canaan, including Joshua, can go up into her abode in the walls of Jericho and get like inside information. And she asks like, yeah, I'll let you destroy the city, but spare me and my household, we'll become Israelites, right? So there's this motif of Joshua marrying Rahab the prostitute, which is kind of interesting because in the Christian cosmology, the eponymous Jesus Christ, right, who's Joshua as well, right, for all intents and purposes, he cosmologically marries, not carnally, but he marries the Samaritan woman who's like a bit of a, you know, prostitute-like figure and redeems her. So too Simon Magus in his apocryphal mythos that's recorded in like Saint Irenaeus's heresiological texts. He also like marries a prostitute. So there's this theme of like redeemers taking on, you know, loose women to restore them and so on. It's a theme throughout the whole Hebrew Bible, actually, this idea of like the whore-like bride of God who is namely his people like straying and then coming back, right? But at any rate, so just reading the Aramaic Talmudic text there from this passage, Megillah, it says that Rabbi Nachman said that Huldah, who's a prophetess who was from among the children of his children, i.e. was like a descendant of Joshua of Nun's offspring. And it is written that, well, it is written in the Torah, this phrase, ben charchas, and it is also written elsewhere, a place name, namely Timnat Heres. So what the idea is there's this playing of a genealogy, a figure who's a child of Charchas with this toponym that ends in Heres. that so the idea is that Huldah was a famous biblical prophetess, right? She's the wife of Shalom, who's the son of Tikvah, who in turn is the son of Charchas. So her genealogy is linked to the place where Joshua, son of Nun, is buried, because that's there you see in the Hebrew text, I should say, the Betimnat Cheres, that means in Timnat Heres, which is interpreted as meaning like as being associated with that figure, Karachas, who's his later descendant, if that makes sense. So they're making this connection between the toponym of the tomb of Joshua with this later apparent descendant connected to the prophetess Huldah. And then furthermore, this same passage of the Talmud says that it is written, Ben Tikvah, the son of Tikvah, as you see in that genealogy of Huldah, her patrilineal descent. So there's a figure called Tikvah, and it's also written elsewhere, the Talmud says, that Tikvat Chut Chashani, so a scarlet thread and cord, i.e. referring to the passage of the story that tells the story I said before of the harlot helping the spies ascend the walls of Jericho. Right, she dangled down a scarlet thread. So the scarlet thread, the tikvat, is being connected to the tikvah, the name of this descendant of Joshua, son of Nun, which is cool. Now, further tales from the Greek world that connect to the Judas Iscariot mythology that we are tracking here. So, firstly, we're going to be reading this Latin passage just because it's convenient. There are other sources where you could find this information, but this is from the Fabulae of Hyginus. Hyginus is like a late antique, sort of like 200 AD, around there, author who retells some Greek myths with some particular variants and details. So it's a convenient place to look at this story that, as you can see from the depiction on the left, of a woman and a child in a box that's cast out to sea, hence the seagulls. We're going to see there's a case here of a mother's like bizarre dream vision experience, a bizarre birth, a baby in a box, and so on. Other common motifs. So Danae was the daughter of Acrisius and Aganippe, and it was like prophesied that the child whom she would birth would slay Acrisius, her father. And fearing this, Acrisius like enclosed her in a stone wall in a chamber. But nonetheless, Jove, i.e. Zeus, had relations with her through golden rain. So as you see in the depiction on the right, this flecks of gold falling down onto her body, impregnating her. That's how Zeus impregnated her, through golden rain. So, he got around the enclosure by coming down as rain, golden rain. And so her father, on account of like sexual misconduct, ob stuprum, account of adultery, so he suspected, enclosed her in an ark, a box, along with Perseus, her son, and cast them into the sea. And so by the will of Jove, of Jupiter, they were brought, or the box rather, the ark was brought to the island of Seriphus, and a certain fisherman called Dictys found the chest, and opening it, saw a woman with an infant and brought them to the king Polydectes. And he basically had her, like, the king, that is Polydectes, had the mother Danae like cohabitate with him, and he educated Perseus the child in the temple of Minerva, Athena. And so later, when Acrisius became aware of this, that they were spending time at Polydectes' place, he went forth and he came there, but Polydectes was begging him not to like slay the child, because remember, it's been prophesied that this child will kill him, Acrisius. So Polydectes intervenes and begs King Acrisius and says, why don't we make it such that Perseus gives his, swears an oath, gives his allegiance to his father, that he will not slay him, or rather to his grandfather, I should say, not his father, of course, because Zeus is his father, right? So why doesn't he give trust, make an agreement with his grandfather that he will not slay him? And so, but due to a sea storm, they were kept in place for a while. They couldn't return. Polydectes died in the interim during the storm. And so they performed funerary games for him. So Olympic-like competitions to commemorate his life at his funeral. And at these games, Perseus, the youth, let go of his discus, and the wind took it in such a direction that it struck the head of Acrisius, his grandfather, and killed him. And so even though it did not come about by his intentionality, but rather it was done by the gods, he was buried, and the grandchild went forth to Argos and took up the kingdom of his grandfather. Okay, so here again, there's that common theme of slaying the father unbeknownst to the son, and it's the idea that it's fated. It's not just the ill intentions of the slayer, right? There's this element almost of fate or divine orchestration. Okay. Now, in the same source, a further tale is told. You can see that nice mosaic there as well, which tells the tale quite clearly. Yeah, right. So that mosaic is actually from Turkey. I think close to the border of Syria, I think it is. At any rate, that image will make more sense once we hear this story. But you can see there the sea creature motif that I brought up earlier is kind of thrown into the mix of this typology as well, which is interesting. So a certain Cassiope, her daughter Andromeda, Cassiope compared her daughter Andromeda to the Nereids, right? These sea divinity women. She compared her form, her beauty, i.e., to those divinities, and this caused Neptune to be insulted and irate, such that he sent a sea creature, a cetus, to he made it such that he was going to the girl Andromeda, the daughter of King Cepheus, was going to be fed to this sea monster, right? And so when she was cast out, though, Perseus was flying by using the winged sandals of Mercury, of Hermes, right? And he came to liberate her from danger. And so he sought to abduct her, but her father Cepheus, with Agenor, who was to whom she had been betrothed, right? So her bridegroom or man to be, so to speak. They sought to, they plotted to kill Perseus because they didn't want him to abduct her and marry her. And so, since he became aware of this plot, he showed to them the head of the Gorgon that you see actually hanging there by his side in the mosaic. He showed the head of the Gorgon to them, and they turned into stone and lost their like human aspect, right? So they were petrified, literally. And so Perseus returned to his country with Andromeda, and when Polydectes, remember the king from earlier, saw Perseus and what virtue he had, he was frightened and so he like plotted to kill Perseus through some kind of deceitful trick. But becoming aware of this plot as well, Perseus showed to him, i.e. Polydectes, the head of the Gorgon, and he too was changed from his human appearance to stone. So just of interest that there's this sea monster motif, this saving of the maiden motif, because we saw that with Joshua of Nun as well. He had the sea monster interaction, he had the saving of the maiden motif with the scarlet thread, right? And he became the bride of this woman who was spared from the destroyed city of Jericho, right? So there's all these analogisms between like destroyed cities, maidens being saved, sea creatures, sons accidentally killing their fathers as per prophecies. It's kind of interesting. So now there's a passage here from Pseudo-Apollodorus's Bibliotheca. So when Heracles saw them, the Amazonian warrior women, namely, when he saw these Amazonians are armed to the teeth, so to speak, he killed Hippolyta, their queen, and took off her belt. And then he fought against the other Amazonian women and then sailed off to Troy. And at that time, it so happened that the city was under the wrath of Apollo and Poseidon. So Apollo and Poseidon were seeking to test the hubris of Laomedon, the king. And so they took on the appearance of humans, and they offered, for the sake of a wage, to build up Pergamus. Now, people think that means like Pergamon, the city, but I think that's a misinterpretation. I think that term is just applied to the Acropolis of Troy. So it's talking about the walls of Troy, I'm pretty sure. I would beg to disagree with interpreters who say otherwise. But it doesn't really matter, whatever. The point is that they, nonetheless, he did not, they were not given the wage for the work that they did in building the wall. And so on account of this, Apollo sent a plague, and Poseidon sent the Cetus, right, the Kertos, that sea monster, that was brought along with like a surge of water. And it was like snatching up people on the plains about the city. And so there was a prophecy that they would only be liberated from these disasters if Laomedon put forth his daughter Hesione to be eaten by the Cetus. And so he bound her by these rocks at the seaside close to the city. And when Heracles saw her, having returned from his war against the Amazonians, right, he promised to save her if he could receive the horses from Laomedon. And these horses, namely, were the price which Zeus had paid to Tros, whose name gives us the Troad, who was the king and father of Ganymedes, who was the pretty boy whom Zeus abducted to keep as like a wine pourer in heavens and presumably to exploit carnally. We get the word catamite from the word Ganymedes. And so Heracles gets the horses that were given by Zeus to Ganymedes' father, and which Laomedon had inherited. They get passed on now to Heracles. and Heracles, kills the sea monster, the Cetus, and liberates Hesione. But since Laomedon, after his daughter was saved from the sea creature by Heracles, refuses to give up the horses as he promised, Heracles actually besieges, wars against Troy and takes hold of the city, conquers the city himself. So again, this interesting motif of the maiden offered as sacrifice to the sea monster, and the city falling as a result of hubris. So Apollodorus also gives us further details about the lineage of the divine house of Troy. Now, this might seem like a far cry from our Judas Iscariot narrative, but I just want to flesh out that prophecy about Paris the child in the dream being like a torch who consumes his whole city. By seeing some of the backstory of the dynasty of Troy, we can appreciate the broader typology of universal history and how the story of Troy and the story of Jerusalem are quite alike in many ways and are linked through common typologies. Okay, so Apollodorus tells us elsewhere in his Bibliotheca text that Electra, one of the Pleiades, daughters of Atlas, right, the Titan holding up the heavens, who was tricked by Heracles into doing so, when Heracles took the apples of the Hesperides. At any rate, so Electra, daughter of Atlas, from her is descended. She's the daughter, I should say, of. Pardon me. Try again. So Iasion and Dardanus, whose name is given to the Dardanelles, incidentally. So Iasion and Dardanus are children of Zeus and of Electra, one of the Pleiades, who's a daughter of Atlas. Okay, so you have these two brothers, Iasion and Dardanus. Okay, with divine parentage from Electra, one of the Pleiades, and Zeus. Okay, now Iasion, he is enamored with erotically Demeter, the famous goddess of grains, right, of cereals. But since he desired to shame the goddess by copulating with her, he was killed by lightning. Now, as a side note, Homer and Hesiod have a different tale of Demeter lying on her back and copulating with Iasion, and them having a child, Plutos, who means like wealth, i.e., wealth of the earth together. And there's a scene where like she gets spotted by other deities as having dirt on her back that shows that she was lying on her back during coitus in a plowed field. But at any rate, in this version, he's killed for attempting to copulate with her. So Dardanus, the other brother, is saddened by his brother's death via lightning. And so he leaves Samothrace, which is their home country. Remember, that's the site where Alexander the Great's parents met. You can see ruins there on the right and a waterfall from that place. Now, Dardanus leaves there and he goes across to the mainland. And in that land there rules a king called Teucrus, who is the son of the river Scamander and of the nymph Idea. And the people who dwelt in that country were called Teucrians as a result of Teucrus, right? And this Teucrus king received Dardanus, and Dardanus got a hold of some land as well as the daughter of the king, Batea, and Dardanus built a city. And when Teucrus died, the whole region became called Dardania from Dardanus. and sons arose to him called Ilus, hence Ilium, the name of the city, and Erichthonius. So Ilus died without children, whereas Erichthonius succeeded the kingdom, became king, and he married Astiochane, who was the daughter of a river deity, Simois, and they birthed together Tros, who, if you recall, was the father of Ganymedes, who was abducted by Zeus in eagle form, as per Apollodorus. At any rate, returning to the text, Ilus, though, that other figure who's mentioned, went to Phrygia, and he competed in like athletic games, namely wrestling, that were hosted by the king there, and he won. And as a reward, he received 50 boys and 50 maidens, right? So these sets of youths for breeding purposes, so to speak, as a reward for winning in this wrestling match. They were given to him by the king, and there another kind of prophecy was given to the king, namely that a spotted cow, where she, in the place where this spotted cow would recline, he should build a city. Okay. Now, as a side note, with that cow stopping its wandering at a certain spot, and that spot being the base of a city, there's the later kind of Virgilian myth of Aeneas founding Alba Longia, that is basically the city of Rome, at a spot where a sow like sat down to suckle. Hence, you see the depiction there. That's like a key foundation myth of Rome. That links it, though, to this common motif of tetrapods moving around, settling on a spot according to prophecy. So those two prophecies link the founding of Ilus's Ilium, i.e. Troy, and Aeneas's Alba Longia, that will become Romulus and Remus's Rome. Right? Highly significant to link these typologies of empire and fratricide and so on together. So the key point, though, is that the hill in Phrygia where the cow went was called the Hill of Ate, the Hill of Doom. We know from Homer that this deity called Ate, meaning like sinful error, like was cast down from heaven and landed on that hill. Again, this ominous prophetic foreboding, like the place is designated as a place of doom and destruction, and yet that's where the prophecy leads this figure to establish his city, that very city which will later be destroyed by the erotic escapades of Paris with Helen of Sparta, in fulfillment of the dream of his mother, Hecabe/Hecuba, where she saw the burning torch, if we recall the prophecy, right? So, at any rate, Ilus built there the city of Ilium, and he prayed for a sign from Zeus, from heaven, to like approve his founding the city there. And after a day, a palladium, that is a cult statue, an idol, fell down from heaven, and it was seen to be lying down in front of the tent where they were, and it was 3 cubits tall. It was standing on its feet, with its feet together, pressed together, and in the right hand was a spear, and in the other was the deity was holding equipment for weaving. So this is the image of Athena. Now, this is a highly important detail because Cassandra, the prophetess, whom I mentioned earlier, right, a descendant of Priam, a relative of Paris, she, the prophetess who would say this truth but wouldn't be believed, right, because she rejected the sexual advances of Apollo, she is associated with the priestess of Athena. And she, of course, when she later gets abducted by a Greek fellow, Ajax, and she gets dragged away, raped, inverted commas, and taken hostage, and she clings to the idol, this very palladium that fell down from heaven, right, the foundational image of her city, and she begs Athena for help and intervention to preserve her priestess virginity, but instead she's taken away and she's sexually assaulted tragically. And we'll return to that theme of Cassandra basically in greater details later on. But for now, it's worth just turning our attention briefly to a text called the Alexandra or the Cassandra by Lycophron. The dating of this poet is debated. I like to place him in the Hellenistic era in the time of Ptolemy Philadelphus, the pharaoh / Macedonian king of Egypt. It doesn't really matter. Other people say it's a later Roman text, hotly debated. We don't need to get into that. But the point is that this text is named after Cassandra / Alexandra, and she is the voice of the poem. She's the main speaker throughout. And the whole poem is a prophecy. It's depicted as being the bona fide words of this ancient seeress of prehistory, like that foreshadows the rise of Rome as the descendants of the Trojans who will achieve retribution for the wrongs done to her city, and specifically for her abduction and sexual assault. But we'll get into the details of that later. But let's look at this brief passage here that connects the descendants of Atlas, whom we looked at on Samothrace just before, with the myth of like a cataclysm, like a great, like Noah-like flood. So early in the poem, Cassandra / Alexandra, the prophetess, says this: I groan you, O my country, the graves of that diving bird of Atlantean lineage, i.e. a descendant of Atlas, who in a stitched vessel, like a four-legged Istrian fishing trap, had his body all alone inside of a sack, and was like a Cretan seabird from Rethymnon, a place in Crete. He swam from the cave of Zerinthus on Samothrace, the cave of Zerinthus being the cult site of the dog-slaying divinity, namely Hecate, a chthonic goddess associated with a cult that killed dogs. He left behind the citadel, the august, famed citadel of the Corybantes, these dancing divinities of Samothrace, who are associated with the aforementioned Cabaroi and the mystery cults of that island of Samothrace. And this was the time, she says, when a rumbling flood of Zeus rained down on the whole earth and rendered it sand, i.e. leveled it, destroyed it. Right? So much like the Genesis flood, this epic destruction of the earth by Zeus's angry rain. But this one character survives, and namely this figure is Dardanus, and he does so by stitching himself up in a leather sack around his body that like floats, and he survives the flood. And so those who put their trust like in the towers of the plain, right? Those towers were like cast down by this flood, and those who like tried to swim saw their like deathly fate before their eyes, i.e. they perished. Most people perished in the flood. She says poetically that the sweet fruit of the grape cluster and also the acorns were consumed by whales and dolphins, and seals jumped into the beds of mortals to engage in apparently in sexual activity. But the idea here is this like subversion of order where sea creatures enter the realm of humans and all the humans drown in this tragic flood. So just interesting that there's the figure Dardanus who goes on to establish Dardania, the region that will become Troy, is like this flood survivor. And then later, as we saw, there's this relative Ilus who establishes Ilium, Troy, on the Hill of Doom. So in this poem, the Alexandra, this we'll call it Hellenistic poem, by a certain Lycophron. In this poem, she bewails her fate. At the very beginning, she refers to the sea kind of in this kenning as Thetis who slays maidens. Okay, now what she means by that is she's referring to the fact that the mythic figure Hele, a maiden, and her brother Phrixus were atop like a flying ram, and Hele fell off and died in the sea, and that sea became the Hellespont, the Sea of Hele, hence the maiden slaying sea. But there's a further pun that we're going to see. There's an allusion there to the Locrian maiden tribute. Now, what is that? So when Cassandra / Alexandra was abducted by Ajax, as you see on that Pompeian fresco, she was clinging to the Palladium, the cult statue that fell from the sky on the site of the Doom's, the Hill of Doom, right? That would become Troy. She was begging the goddess, like, defend my virginity, but alas, she was sexually assaulted and abducted. But she, like, instituted through a powerful, like, curse upon the lineage of her abductor and sexual assaulter this tax whereby the maidens of Locris, his hometown, Ajax's hometown, would be sent like annually as tribute to serve as virgin priestesses of the cult of Athena in Troy, from which Cassandra / Alexandra was abducted. And they would often be like slain by the locals in like a violent ritual, as we're going to see. So there's this idea of like a blood tax of Greek maidens in retaliation for the vile wrong perpetrated against a priestess of a divinity. Okay? And so Cassandra here is speaking prophetically. At the beginning of the text, in like lines 30 around there, she says, I hold my mouth, my Bacchic mouth, my Dionysian mouth, as being divinely inspired, having the power of God therein. And from atop the hills that were the high hills that were established by bovine wanderings from the Hill of Doom, I begin these words, the words of Alexandra. So that's the prologue, the incipit, if you will. I don't think it's actually Alexandra talking there per se. It's the bit that introduces her verbatim words, and the whole text that follows is her speaking. But this is what's interesting. So there shall be a grief unto those lacking their maiden daughters, unto those women lacking their maiden daughters. So, namely, that army leader who engaged in bed activity that was unlawful, i.e., the rapist Ajax, right? This man, Ajax, who was a robber, a violent attacker against the goddess Kypris, right, meaning Aphrodite of Cyprus, these women shall bewail for a long time, and they shall send forth this unjust allotment, and their children shall be deprived of marriage. So she's alluding to the fact that these children, these maidens, will be sent off like as a blood tax to the deity in retribution for her sexual assault. So you shall pay for the sacrilegious marriage, inverted commas. You shall pay a price to Gaia, to Athena, Agriska. These are just cult epithets of that goddess Athena. Shall pay a price for 1,000 years. These unmarried maidens shall be sent. And then she says that they shall die as foreigners in a foreign land without like proper burial rites. And she says that they will like be cast off into the sandy seashore, and their limbs shall be likened to fruitless plants. They'll be cast out and burnt by Hephaestus, and their dust, their ashes shall be cast into the sea, from the hill of Traron. So what that means to say is that they will die in a foreign land, they will be cremated, and their remains will be cast without proper funerary rites, like into the sea. And that's a big deal, we should note culturally, because funerary rites like impact your afterlife. If you don't get a proper funeral, you get cursed and suffer in the afterlife, right? So these maidens will be incinerated and cursed. Okay, back to the text. And so at nighttime, these maidens who will be put to death will arrive at the limbs of the daughter of Sithon. That's referring to Pellene, like a northerly region. And they shall look about as they make their secret path in darkness to enter the house of the goddess Athena as supplicants beseeching her, clasping her knees, much as Cassandra is doing there in that Pompeian fresco. So they're going to come as beggars of the deity for mercy themselves, these maidens who are sent as tribute. And they shall sweep and adorn the region of the sanctum of the goddess, and they shall make it shine with dew, and they will have to escape the unloving rage of the citizens of Troy. For every man of Ilium of Troy shall look at these maidens and cease to slay them with a rock in their hands, or with a dark sword, or with some a bovine slaying axe, or with a stick from the region of Philocrea thereabouts, and they shall be eager to satisfy their hand that thirsts for blood. And the people shall with impunity slay, and that person who slays will be praised, and a law will be passed that will be chiseled out, blessing this the stock of the man who perpetrated that crime. So what's Alexandra saying here? Part of the mythos and the ritual of this event, these maidens sent as blood tribute to atone for the sacrilegious rape of the virgin priestess in the temple of Athena, right? Part of the price is that these maidens get sent by a boat, and they in the night try to sneak up to get sanctuary by holding on to the statue of Athena. But in the interim, there's all these men all about who are posted to intercept them and maim them and kill them. Now, this was actually done ritually. We know that from epigraphy that maidens were actually sent as tribute. Now, they probably weren't killed, perhaps, or maybe they were in the actual ritual that reenacted this. But it might have been more like play fighting, but no doubt it was probably still quite violent and traumatic for the girls involved. At any rate, there is in anthropology a theme of these kinds of brutal bride abduction rituals. It is a thing. At any rate, interestingly, the whole point, we're not going to dwell too long on Alexandra, the poem, because it's a huge and complex poem, but a key part of it is this 1,000-year curse of these maidens being sent across the sea. But then there is this climactic point of the prophecy of Alexandra, where a figure will arise, a wrestler, who will bring about world peace and will unify Asia and Europe and make up for the past war of Troy and the wrongs done between Eastern people and Western people, and will bring about a prosperous age of world peace, and will bring about an end to this 1,000-year-long maiden tribute, right? This millennium of blood tax on human sacrifice. Okay. And so the relevant portion of the text says this: after many contests and bloodsheds through spear wielding, the wrestlings of men on earth shall be loosened, and there through like the struggles of like terrible powers will come to an end, and those who are in the on the land that is turned about by bovines, who turn hither and thither, right, with their plows. And this shall occur when a burning lion, i.e., presumably like a tawny lion, shall put to bed the heavy tumult of conflict. And this lion shall be descended from both Dardanus, i.e., the progenitor of the Trojans, and from Aeacus, the progenitor of Achilles, and by extension, like the royal line of the Greeks. And he shall be at the same time a Thesprotian and a Calastrian lion. So that is to say, from the region of Epirus and the region of Macedonia. So he shall like take a hold of the whole house of those who are of the same blood, and he shall force the chiefs of the Argives, presumably the Persians, interpreters say here, even though that's not typically what Argive means. He shall convince the princes of the Argives / Persians to like as puppies to like beg the wolf commander of Galadra, another place in Macedonia, and shall make him stretch out the scepter of his monarchy, of his like divine rule. And in this, the 6th generation of my own kinspeople, of my own blood, says Cassandra, right, the Trojan prophetess, there shall be a certain wrestler, and he shall put together, unite the might of the spear and of the sea, and he shall put together the might of the spear of sea and land, and shall bring about reconciliation. And he shall be praised as a most reverend elder amongst his friends, and he shall seize for himself like the spoils that are won, the first of the spoils that are won by the spear. So what does all that mean? So there's like this, there's a wolf, there's a lion, and there's a wrestler. So this is kind of the imagery that we get in oracular literature, like, you know, you might remember the beasts of the book of Daniel or the book of the Revelation of John in the end of the New Testament. There's this kind of animal apocalypse. We get an animal apocalypse in the Ethiopic book of Enoch as well. It's that same sort of theme, this like animal symbolism of oracles and prophecies. There's lots of debate about who these characters are. My personal favorite in identification is to claim that the lion who unifies Trojan and Macedonian bloodlines and is both from Epirus and from Macedonia is Pyrrhus, right? The famous Macedonian who like attacks Italy, right? And notice that there's like this repeated theme in the Pyrrhus identity of like a Greek warring against Trojans, now like Romans, in Italy. So it's a recurring theme of the old conflict is renewed in his time. But the wolf, I think, here is who gets together all these chiefs of the Argives, rather than interpreting it as Persians as some do. I think it means more Demetrius Poliorcetes, who like subdues the kings of the Greeks and becomes like an ultimate king figure. I think he's the wolf. Now, as for who the Roman is, I mean, I say Roman because there's the wrestler who actually brings about world peace and brings about reconciliation of the land and sea, meaning like a cosmic restoration of peace, not just peace in the sense of nations no longer warring, but like a kind of the waves no longer bash the earth, right? Like there's actually cosmic stability. He's like a messiah figure, frankly. There are like texts from roughly the same time period from Egypt, like the Potter's Oracle or the Oracle of the Lamb, that depict like Isis, the divinity of the Egyptians, like appointing like a semi-divine human king as like a messiah who brings about world peace. You can think of like in the book of Isaiah, I believe, there's this imagery of like, and it occurs elsewhere in the Hebrew prophets, like the spears will be beaten into plows. You know, this idea of like the implements of war will be turned to implements of peace, and there shall be no more war in this age of like messianic restoration. That's part of this prophecy. So now you start to see, right, where I'm going with all this stuff. But what did all this have to do with Judas Iscariot? Not only do we have the common typology of like the baby that's like cast out, that comes back and kills the father, because remember Paris, the prince of Troy, there's a dream foreshadowing his birth that will bring about the destruction of his city. So they plot like maybe we should kill him, but decide not to and abandon him when he returns. Not only is there that element, but it also all ties into like a much broader theme of like almost messianic restoration and universal history that's so amazingly expounded in Lycophron's Alexandra. And it's amazing that this text is not spoken about. Even classicists, um, even people specializing in Hellenistic poetry, don't study this text enough. It has a really compelling view of universal history that connects to a lot of other things, and it's a shame it's neglected. And I hope you don't mind that in this video that started off about Judas Iscariot, we've taken this deep dive into this kind of lore. Hopefully it's of interest to people. So the text also has some further typological content that's of interest. We can see there the slaying of Astyanax in that painting, right? The infant princeling of Troy who's killed by Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, right? A very tragic episode. So Alexandra, in the eponymous poem, The Alexandra, right? So this priestess, prophetess of Troy, says that Palaemon, who is the son of Ino or Leucothea, the white goddess of the sea, he is described with the epithet Brephoktonos, which means child slain. So Palaemon himself, the child of this like sea divinity woman, becomes a divinity who's worshipped through the sacrifice of infant children, right? And so there's an allusion to him. And then Alexandra continues and says that the elderly Titaness, wife of Oganus or Oceanus, who shares his bed, like was warm and boiling and frothing, right, as these seagulls comprised of woven cables glided on her surface. Now, what does that mean? So what that is referring to is the fact that the Greek army, in seeking to take Troy, their ships passed through the waters, being the body of the wife of Oceanus, who is the waters, right? The ocean. They went past the actual cult site of the island of Tenedos, which is where these infants were killed. The site is also associated with Dionysus Anthroporistes, meaning the man-slaying Dionysus, like this dismembering cult, like all these human sacrifices going on this peculiar island right next to Troy, right? So then she continues that there were these two children born to the same father who was slain with a millstone that struck his sturdy millstone that struck like his collarbone. And this was as a result of as a result, these children, as this was brought about by the lying words of a certain aulos player, like aulos is like a shrill flute-like instrument. It's not really a flute, it's a kazoo, like a kazoo-like instrument, let's say. So this kazoo player, through his lying words, brought about children of that father who was killed with the millstone, the two children were placed in a larnax, that is like a box or coffin, much like Perseus before and Judas Iscariot and Moses and so on. And this box of these two brothers, whose father had just been killed, were cast out. And then it says that a certain butcherer Artamos, a certain butcherer of children, a grim butcher of children, obeyed him, that is the kazoo player, and he was a man who himself was reared by seagulls and was caught in the nets of fishermen. So again, that motif of fishermen hauling up a baby, as we saw with Perseus. And the poem goes on and says, we'll explain exactly what all this means very soon. You can see the explanatory footnotes there at the bottom, because the actual style of the poem, the Alexandra, is like very cryptic and bizarre, and it's supposed to be like that because the idea is, right, that it's a prophecy, and prophecy is always like coded, divinely inspired language that you need to interpret through skillful exegesis. It's not apparent to just your average person. Okay, so the text goes on and says that the two children were like locked up in a chest or ark, a box, and a certain wretched man was not cognitive, was not aware of the commands of a mother, and he instead slipped into a state of like lethargic forgetfulness, and as a result, he was struck with a sword and fell down in the chest and fell down face forward and died. Now, what exactly is this all referring to? So who are these two children? Well, the two children are Tenes and Hemithea, and they are children of a certain Kuknos by his first wife, Proclea. Now, Proclea, I'm pretty sure, I could be in error, but I'm pretty sure is a daughter of, if not Priam, of Laomedon, like she's a Trojan princess. Kuknos' name means like swan, which is of some interest. Now, what's interesting, so they're the first sets of children from the first wife. But Kuknos or Tiknos remarries a certain Philonome, and she, at the instigation of a kazoo player called Molpos, pressures Kuknos into placing the children in a box and setting them across into the sea. And they land on the island of Tenedos. That gets its name from the boy of the twins, of the two children, Tenes. And it's specified too that in elsewhere in other sources that Tenes is actually not really the child of Kuknos, but rather is Apollo's child. And yeah, so the island where they land was originally called Leucophreus, which means like white brow. But it was renamed Tenedos when this child became king there. As a side note, the word Leucophreus occurs in Lycophron's poem, The Alexandra, and I can't help but think that there's like a pun there on the name, because the names are sort of similar, right? Leucophreus and Lycophron, right? But some people, I've had people say to me that they don't sound similar enough for that to be a pun, which, I mean, okay, if you say so. At any rate, and I think the reason for that pun, incidentally, is that there's a lot of like sparagmatic imagery that is like imagery of dismemberment and like ritual slaying that occurs throughout the poem, not just with the like Locrian maidens undergoing violent death themselves, but like there's an account of the Triesphoros lion, the night of the lion of three evenings, namely Heracles, who was like swallowed inside of the sea monster sent against Troy. And like though he was in there for 3 days, cut open and arose victorious, much like Jonah and Christ in a way, with the 3-day death in the sea creature and arising anew and so on, and saving a maiden, right? Just as like, you know, these figures like Joshua saved the you know, like the harlot from the city dune for destruction and so on. There's these like common typologies, and the wrestler figure, the messianic Trojan Roman who's going to bring about world peace in the poem, right? The grand savior. He's called a wrestler because Heracles too is a wrestler. So again, like he's in this kind of typology of god men who saved the maiden from the sea creature and so on. That's an interesting typological framework. But returning to Tenedos now, so Kykenos himself is a son of Poseidon, and he's killed by Achilles, in other sources tell us. And that was considered like connected prophetically to the later fall of Troy. What else is there to say? The reason Kykenos is referred to cryptically by Alexandra there as like reared by gulls and snacked up by the net of fishermen is because he was himself, as a child of Callice, who had sexual relations with Poseidon. He was like exposed on the seashore and was reared by seagulls until he was taken in by fishermen. So again, there's that common motif. And the forgetful fellow who didn't listen to his mother refers to Mnemon, who was sent by Thetis, the sea nymph and mother of Achilles, to tell him not to kill Tenes. Yet nonetheless, Achilles didn't get the memo and actually did kill Tenes. So what has this to do with our theme? Well, as I mentioned earlier, Astyanax, the prince babe of Troy, who's slain by Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, the fact that Achilles kills this boy Tenes on Tenedos, who again is like a child of divine lineage. It's all connected to this theme of like the kind of child that's cast out into the sea. It's difficult to explain, but there are these common recurring motifs of like the child cast out to sea, the destruction of a city, this slaying of humans in these terrible circumstances. There's the sea monster motif. Like there's this peculiar conglomeration, constellation of motifs. And the slaying of the child element, if we recall, there's the fratricide in the cult of Samothrace of the Cabaroi. There's also the fratricide in the case of Judas Iscariot, right? And also the Dionysian mysteries associated with the blood-shedding cult of Tenedos. You know the story perhaps that I'll talk about in another video of Dionysus as an infant being torn apart and eaten by the Titans. You can see that chilling depiction there of an infant being killed that's it's like basically a Minoan depiction there. So it's contemporary really with the Trojan War in a sense. So we get this other passage here from the Alexandra that I'll just briefly translate. Okay, so the passage says, I now look out over this coil of evils that is dragged about through the sea foam that rages against my homeland, my country, with terrible threats and with damages brought about through fire that is to come. And a certain Cadmilus, that is Hermes, this alternative title of Hermes, Hermes should not have, ought not have brought to the island of Issa, that is girt by sea, and implanted therein a guide on foot of the enemies. Now, what's that talking about? So Issa is Lesbos or Mytilene, the island very near Troy, and the guide being referred to here is a collaborator who is related to the Trojans but works with the Greeks to bring about the destruction of Troy. So she continues. And Issa is an alternative name for the island, but is also a genealogical figure as well. So the text says, the fourth from that wretched Atlas, the fourth seed, or scion, so to speak, from Scion, however you say that, child that is descended from Atlas, from the wretched Atlas. So there's I've inserted there the genealogy: Atlas, Maya, and Hermes, and then Prilus. So the idea is that what it means by Hermes leading him is Hermes is part of the genealogy of this traitor, so to speak, who is like a Dardanid, like is related to the Trojans, but helps the Greeks bring about the destruction of Troy. So the text says, "You who work towards burying your kinspeople by blood, O Prilus, you were like a priestly prophet who spoke without any kind of inaccuracy or error with respect to these things, namely the destruction of the city." And then Cassandra herself, because remember, she's just part of the royal house of King Priam and is related to Paris. She bemoans the situation, says, "Oh, if only my father ought to have not rejected the oracles, the prophecies of Essacus." If you recall earlier, the guy turned into a bird who said that this child Paris will destroy our city and we should kill him whilst he's an infant. She said, "Oh, if only we had obeyed that prophecy," right? And she said, "We should have not dismissed those fearful images that wander about the night, i.e. dreams." And because Homer famously has an image, right, of different kinds of dreams and visions coming through different gates in the underworld, one of ivory and I think one of bronze, some being good, some being bad, if I recall correctly. But anyway, returning to this, we should have paid attention to these night visions. If only we had killed that baby, right, is what she's saying. We should have killed them or hidden them, i.e. killed them, both, the two of them, i.e. that is to say, Priam should have killed Paris the child and Hecuba or Hecabe the mother as well. For the sake of our country's future fate/doom, right? We should have burnt their limbs in the flame of Lemnos, right? That is in the volcano of Hephaestus, who dwells on Lemnos and has his forge there, right? Homer tells us he was cast down by Hera onto that island because he was rejected because he was an ugly baby, right? And if that had been done, if the baby had been incinerated there, then all these evils would not have befallen my country. So again, on this closing point, we have that common theme with Judas Iscariot of the child that ought to be destroyed because this child will bring about the destruction of their civilization. So hopefully you can appreciate that sidetrack into Trojan lore and appreciate this image of universal history. And you can see in other myths as well, this kind of motif, the Oedipus story and the dream and the baby and so on, how all these motifs come together and provide a really compelling image. All right, well, that is all. Hope you enjoyed and see you next time.